Richard Miller, and I'm principally teaching meditation, and I've developed a particular approach to meditation, which I'm calling iRest, or integrative restoration, but it comes out of the Kashmir non-dual tradition of meditation. So it's a structure that's very secular, so that I'm able to bring it not just to people who want to learn meditation, who I call the choir, but people in homeless shelters, veterans from different wars, wounded warriors, their families, their children, and then we're bringing it into chemical dependency units. Plus we're looking at doing research, so we've done about 20 research projects looking at the impact that meditation has on healing post-traumatic stress syndrome, chronic pain, sleep-related issues, anxiety, depression, and then really how it enhances the sense of well-being and resiliency in just the everyday person, as well as the whole process of awakening to our essential nature for those who want to go on. Because often when I'm working more in a secular domain with people, after they've gone through a certain part of the meditation protocol, they'll often say, "Thank you very much, I got what I needed, I'll see you in the marketplace." Others say there's something more here, aren't they? Isn't there? And I say, yeah, and then they continue on to the deeper aspects or explorations of what truly for me meditation is all about, where it really takes us ultimately. And one more thing, when I think of meditation, I think of it as a lifestyle, the way we live our life, the principles that we come to understand. So for me, it's as important for someone to have the awakening to their essential nature as it is to bring that back into their daily life and interweave it into their relationships, their work, their relationship with their children. In other words, really bringing it into a worldly life.
And to understand you more, what's the background from which you came to meditation? Or spiritual?
I come originally with a bachelor's of science in psychology and a master's in education and a PhD in clinical psychology. But early on in my career, before I had done much studies, I was volunteering in a free clinic looking to learn the art of how to work with people using psychology principles. And I met a woman who became my mentor. She had just recently come from the Far East. She had grown up in a Buddhist community, but had been taught the principles of yoga as a young girl. So she grew up with an integration of Buddhism, yoga, and psychology, because she herself had studied with Eric Fromm and others in the humanistic movement. So from the very beginning, when I started looking at sitting with the person and helping them psychologically, there was a full-on integration of both Eastern and Western principles. I also, at that early time in my early years, exploring different Christian concepts. I actually hung out with a Jesuit priest for a year, where every Sunday we went to a different service, and he really showed me that my path was really yoga. And then along the way I also met a Taoist master and worked with him for many years, wrote a book for him, a book of internal exercises. And so I was integrating these Eastern concepts with the Western Judo Christianity perspective, the Taoist perspective, the Mahayana and the Zen Buddhism that I was studying, and the principles of yoga. And early on, the teachings of non-dualism started grabbing my attention when I would go to bookstores or I would find myself to lectures. It was often a book would fall into my lap on non-dualism, or like the books from Shankaracharya, or I would go to hear a lecture. So I became very fascinated in how these principles of the non-dual perspective, which I also saw as the underpinnings of what I would call mystical Judeo-Christianity, and the underpinnings of Taoism that I was studying, it was all non-dual from how I was seeing it and framing it. So I basically entered into a series of teachers who helped me integrate the teachings both at a cognitive, intellectual level, but more as an experiential level. Because I was always interested in how does the body incorporate these ideas, these understandings. And then in 1984, I met who would become my principal spiritual mentor, Jean Klein, and had almost 15...
Jean Klein?
Jean Klein, Jeanklein, Jean Klein, and had some 15 years with him before he passed on, very intimate dialogues. And he had integrated very deeply the somatic aspect of awakening. So it wasn't just an intellectual awakening, it was a full body, full heart integration. And because he himself came out of the West, it was also an integration into relationships and daily life. So he really was echoing my own interest.
Okay, I get it. And after you began to create the technology, iRest.
In 1970, when I took my first yoga class, at the end of the class, the teacher taught a rudimentary, what I call now Yoga Nidra, and I had a very deep spiritual opening where I felt myself not separate from the entire universe. And I really deeply walked home that night this kind of internal vow to really study this and come to understand it, because this was what I had been looking for years. And so I began to read everything I could on yoga in general, the Upanishads, but then books on Yoga Nidra, and began to use the teachings both for myself and in classes that I was teaching and exploring it with my students. And what occurred to me was many of the concepts that were being used were archetypal imagery and symbols from the East, which weren't my symbols. They weren't ones that I grew up culturally. So I started to strip away what I would call the cultural aspects of the practice and trying to look at what are the underlying principles, and I came up with basically 10 core principles that I saw each one grew out of the prior one and open to a tremendous understanding. So I started developing these 10 principles. Just briefly, the felt sense of life living us that gives rise to a deep intention. In Sanskrit, that word is often mumukshva, which means a deep longing for liberation from suffering. That gave rise to a very deep core sense of presence that then opened me to explore the body, the senses, the mind, emotions, and thoughts, and joy, and realizing that all those, while beautiful expressions of life, often became fixations that we became trapped in, pretending I'm a body, these are my emotions. And so, as we explored them, as I explored them, there was a spontaneous disidentification that came ultimately to the deep question, what is this I that keeps appropriating and glomming on to whatever emotion thought is arising? So I formulated a ninth step in my protocol where we really examined that I thought and took it down to its most subtle aspect and how it maintains a sense of separation along with the mind and the senses. And in that moment, there can be a freeing from that thought, really just seeing it as a thought, and a falling back into what is a priori prior to our I thought, where we have a deep non-mental experience of our true nature, of our most essential nature, and then there's a coming back as we, in a way, reassemble as the body, senses, and mind, that understanding starts to permeate. As I really studied those 10 principles, which I got from the teachings of yoga and Patanjali and Advaita, I ran into the teachings of Kashmir Shaivism, which offers us basically a 38-stage map. And I saw that the 10 stages that I was working with fit perfectly into that map.
38 stage.
It's a 38-stage map
of whole spiritual development.
Of whole spiritual development. It's really a developmental map that shows how we've involuted and become what we think of ourselves as a separate individual, and then it offers a whole evolutionary view of how we realize ourselves as non-separate consciousness.
So it's kind of 2 stages, involution first and then evolution.
Right. So I would say the involution is what's happened to us as human beings. We, around 18 months, our cognitive structure really comes online. We begin to pretend or get hypnotically induced into thinking of ourselves as a separate individual and grow up in a culture and a world that reinforces that. And so we really concretize as a human being in a body with a mind, with senses and emotions. Then there comes a moment, I think, hopefully in everyone's life, where we begin to feel something's not all right here in the land of Oz. And that happened to me very early on. So I began to explore, what is this basic sense of self? And that map offered me a deeper way of walking through who I took myself to be, peeling those layers off 37 steps at a time to the 38th step, where basically we fall out of the map and realize who we really are.